Hey guys, this is Patrick from STH. Today, we're going to do something that's a little bit different from a lot of the videos that we do on this channel. We normally talk a lot about hardware and some of the cool hardware things that, we go through our lab. We also talk about some of the cool industry events and some things that we're finding. But today, we're going to do something that I think is a lot different, and it's something that we have done on STH for absolutely years. Specifically, I wanted to address what our analysis looks like when we talk about how we think of our hosting and how we do co-location and for our hosting versus using Amazon AWS. Now, STH as a website has been around since 2009. And when we started that hosting journey, we were on a shared hosting server like I think a lot of folks are. And then, as it got larger, we had a VPS, and then we eventually went to Amazon EC2 and AWS. But an issue that we had in the 2012 or so timeline is that we started getting a little bit more traffic. And then the other kind of thing that was happening at about the same time was that AWS, we were starting to see in our instances like seg faults and stuff like that. Back in those days, the EC2 instances were largely hard drive backed. And so you would actually get some IOPS issues in some of the just instances that they had. You have to remember that back then the SSDs were like Fusion IO SSD, and really the NVMe SSD hadn't kind of taken over. Even the SATA SSDs were not great at that point. And so it was a lot different times than today. So in February 2013, we actually made the jump from AWS to our own colocation. And when we did that back in 2013, we actually had a little series that we called Falling from the Sky. We probably should have called it Falling from the Clouds, but I guess I'm just a moron at naming things. In part one of the series, we described some of the problems that we were having and why we were leaving the cloud. And then in part three of the series, which is a little bit more applicable, we talked about looking at a couple different options, and that included looking at VPSs, looking at dedicated hosting, co-location, and going back to AWS. Now, in 2013, STH was much smaller. Our budgets were super small. I was still working at PricewaterhouseCoopers, so I was still doing consulting for PwC, and this was just kind of something I was doing on nights and weekends. And ever since then, our co-location infrastructure has evolved, I would say, a huge amount. I mean, we basically have things now where we can let the co-location go run for a year or something like that, and we don't even go to the facility. So in this video and the accompanying article that's on the STH main site that we're going to link below, I wanted to talk a little bit about the analysis that we did in 2018 to decide, hey, is this still a valid option? And I want to actually go through that in this video because I think it's important because I tend to overestimate things, and you're going to see why I think there. And then I also want to go and after we've done that little exercise, I want to go look at our current situation and see, does it still make sense, or has Amazon become basically the place to go because it's become a lot less expensive? So let's get started with our 2018 analysis. And I'm going to just look at this on the screen over here. But at that point, what we were doing is we were comparing the AWS pricing when you used a 1-year partial upfront situation where you were doing the reserved instance, but you're paying a portion upfront to have lower monthly costs. And at that point, the partial payment was $14,770, which would be in the upfront portion for the infrastructure. And then all of our usage fees would have been $1,675. Over a year, that would have put our hosting at about $34,870 for STH back then. Now, since 2018, STH has actually grown, but we're using the 2018 numbers that we actually published back then. At the same time, we wanted to take a look at our then current co-location, which we had actually moved facilities. We were before in Nevada. Now we host out of California. And back then we were kind of assuming that we would put some money into our service every year. And we kind of figured that that would be about $9,500 of hardware. And then we budgeted about $895 a month for our monthly cost to keep the colo running. So if you put that all together, we were figuring it was going to cost us about $20,240 to go run STH out of colocation, which means that we had a pretty nice saving. We figured that in that year, we would have about $14,630 or so, which is about a 42% savings by doing colocation versus doing AWS. Again, in 2018, the STH main site was a lot smaller, and so that $14,000 was actually a pretty big deal. So that was our hypothesis in terms of how much it would cost to host STH, and we were frankly kind of off. We ended up staying with colocation, but the fact of the matter is that we were using what our traffic was really in like 2017 to kind of inform our 2018 numbers, and we kind of didn't do a good job of figuring out what our growth rate would be. So in the STH main site, our bandwidth needs have grown a ton, even though we've implemented things like lazy loading images and stuff like that, and we've streamlined a lot of the site. We are still just using a lot more bandwidth than we did just because we have more people people looking at things. And the other thing is that we changed our mix. So instead of doing mostly news stories where we may have like one or two little images or maybe some just slideware or something like that, we're doing a lot more hands-on reviews, which means that we do a lot more photography and we have a lot more images that I want to go and make sure that people can see all the really cool stuff that we're seeing. So the pages get bigger plus more traffic means that that combines and you use more bandwidth. That's just the way it is. The nice thing is that since we're in colocation, we actually had enough over-provisioned bandwidth and capacity. That was not even an issue. I mean, we usually are somewhere in the single-digit-ish percentage of our bandwidth allotment every month. So it's really not a big deal in terms of the fact that we grew by 2 or 3x because we're just so far below what our ceiling is that it doesn't really matter. And if you don't understand how data center billing is, we actually have, I think, a guide from like 2014 or 2015 or something like that that we can link in the description, which talks about how all that data center and bandwidth billing works and what you should look for if you're going to go look at colocation. So you can check that guide out. It's still relevant today. Another big change that we didn't necessarily account for was that as we grew the site and we had a lot more content, we have more writers now writing for STH, we actually now use a lot more memory. So a big part of how STH works as a site is that we just cache the heck out of everything. So most stuff gets served directly out of RAM. And because we're serving stuff directly out of RAM, one of the kind of issues that you have is as the site grows, you end up having more stuff that you need to cache and therefore you need more RAM capacity. So a lot of our virtual machines that we use, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a little bit, but a lot of the virtual machines that we use, actually we had to double the total memory footprint just to be able to handle the growing site. Since I'm a big believer in over-provisioning, something that we do is we have the hardware budget to go put extra memory in the machine. So if this kind of thing happens, we don't have to go do an upgrade mid-cycle or something like that. We already have it taken care of. It's no big deal. And so this was by design that we were able to absorb that. But on AWS, it would have meant that we would have had to go to bigger instance sizes and that would have added to costs. So for 2018 comparison purposes, we were okay actually on the colocation side. We weren't necessarily okay in how we judged our AWS costs. The other thing that we did was we had that $9,500 plug for hardware. We didn't necessarily use anywhere near that much. We had an SSD fail, we upgraded a firewall, and I think we did something with an automatic transfer switch and PDU. But overall, I mean, we really just didn't add that much hardware to the thing because it's been working great. And then the big one, everybody always talks about, well, how much you have to go spend servicing servers and all that kind of stuff. And that is, well, I guess maybe kind of true, but maybe it's not. So we budgeted something like $20 a month, and we are just kind of looking at this about 32 months later, which means that we budgeted about $640 for remote hands over the last 32 months. I keep a log of how much both remote hands and also how much labor I have. And in my labor, I also include my commute to the data center and back, and it's far away. I mean, it's like 15 or 20 minutes in the car to get all the way across the bay to where the colocation is. And so when I added up all of the time we spent, we had a pretty big failure and all that kind of stuff. It took a total of about 4 hours of hands-on time since 2018. In fact, we went over a year where we never even touched the hardware at all, and that's really hard for me to do. We did go there for a couple things like getting tools and stuff like that we kind of may have left, specifically I left in the colocation, and so that was minor issue, and that's why I kind of went and did that. But otherwise, we really didn't go to the colocation facility a lot, especially since 2018. Once we kind of figured out the operating model, I think we did a lot better. And so if we look at our 2018 estimates, and I think it's important because if I'm going to tell you my 2020 estimate, and I didn't tell you how I've done previously, I have no track record, but just kind of looking at what I did, I definitely overestimated how much we would spend self-hosting and colocation, and I definitely underestimated the amount that we would spend with AWS. So let's get to the 2020 colocation story. But of course, talking about this comparison, we definitely need to go through and do a couple of big assumptions that we're making here, and they're very important. First off, somebody's going to tell us that we could completely change the way that we do the site. Yes. Now, a good example of that is like all of our containers and all that kind of stuff actually run in VMs. So we run everything in VMs. And that doesn't maybe sound like a big deal, but the reason it is a big deal is just I don't like changing that operating model. The VMs work great. You can do snapshots. There's a whole bunch of features that we get that are really nice with VMs. And so that's why we do it. It's not the most efficient, but it works okay. And so there is something to be said that we could just go and start architecting our stack differently and we could do things better. That is totally true, but that involves changing an operating model that's basically working. So it's just not a big enough issue that I want to go fix it at this point. I just kind of want to leave it and let it go. The second one, and this is a big one, is the fact that we're looking at our data transfer today. We're not looking at what our projected data transfer is if we keep this rate of growth up. We actually run a lot more in our hosting cluster than just the STH website. We also have things, we have like license servers for some of the applications that we run in the lab and stuff, and we run those out of the hosting cluster because we have the extra capacity and the net cost is effectively zero to go do that. And so we're not including all of those types of things, anything that's ancillary that we just are running there because we have free capacity. We're not including that in this analysis because frankly, some of those are VMs that we might run or we might not run in AWS if there was an incremental cost. And so we have to kind of go look at that. But the bandwidth one is also a big one just because AWS bandwidth has gone down in price, but it's still very expensive to transfer things from AWS down to our readers. So for us, data transfer is actually a very expensive thing because if you think about what we do, we kind of go and we'll test something, then we'll go write an article, it'll go into the CMS, and then we'll have, images and all that kind of stuff that get uploaded. But then, millions of people come and go read that stuff and we generate millions and millions of page views every month. And then, that's basically, it's from our servers out to our users. So we don't really have a lot of bandwidth that we're consuming when we upload things into the servers, but we have or when requests from our readers come, but then we have a lot of bandwidth in terms of people pulling data and pulling images and stuff from our website. Now, something we don't have is we don't do video. We don't host video, for example, in our hosting cluster. Instead, we have it on YouTube. And that brings us to our next one, which is that we're not including all the external services that we use. We use YouTube for this. We have, external mail providers. We also have Teespring, for example, that runs our merch shop where you can get a cool sweatshirt just like this. Link in the description. Thought I was going to miss it, but nope, I managed to fit it in here. We also have a weekly newsletter that MailChimp manages that I don't really include in any of this hosting stuff because we use those services anyway. There are also AWS services that we use that we would use if we were hosting on AWS or we're hosting Colocation just because they are good products. And so if there's a good service out there, we look at that more as a service that we're consuming and it's not necessarily part of our hosting costs. Now, some people are going to say that we could take advantage of spot pricing, but at some point you need a very minimal set of VMs. And that's really what we're modeling on the AWS side. Like literally the absolute minimum set of VMs that we could have to go run the site and all the databases and all the stuff that are behind it. The other big one that we're changing in this analysis is that we are using all the big VMs that we're using. We're actually using the AMD EPYC versions of those because they're cheaper than the Intel Xeon powered units. And frankly, for what we use them for, even the first generation AMD EPYC, the Naples 7001 series, those things are absolutely fine for web hosting and they're a lot less expensive. So we're actually using those instead of the Intel ones to go model this, which will bring our cost down on the AWS side. All right, so let's get to numbers, and I'm going to definitely look at the laptop for this because otherwise I'm not going to remember all these numbers. So the first one we're going to look at is what happens when we do a 1-year reserved instance. We don't do anything up front. We just go and we're basically saying, hey, we want an instance for a year, and this is what our reserve pricing is going to be. And under that model, we're spending about $4,300 a month to go do our hosting. So what you can do with AWS is you can actually, especially if you have a base set of VMs or instances that you're going to use, you can actually go and say, hey, we're going to go pay some bit up front and we're going to get a lower monthly recurring cost for those instances. I know they do hourly, but I think of things in terms of monthly, and that's just what it is. So it basically works out when I change that, what we get is we get about a $19,500 upfront cost to go and get all the reserved instances that we need. And then we also have about a $2,500 monthly recurring cost, which is actually not too bad. And we previously looked and really used this 1-year number, but then as we were kind of thinking about it, it kind of doesn't make sense because, well, one way you can look at it is that you're kind of doing this on an annual budgeting cycle, but realistically what we use our servers for in the data centers, we don't just use them for a year, they get put in there for years and years. I know a lot of people assume that just because we have tons of awesome hardware rolling through the lab and we're doing some videos on some of those, but we have a lot of really cool stuff that we're doing on the main site, and you just kind of assume, oh, you guys have so many servers, so why do you guys care about using old servers and stuff like that? Just frankly, those things are less expensive and they're kind of more fit to what we need. And so that's why we use them. And even though we do have tons of Rome chips, and I even have Milan chips at this point, we have the new Ampere Ultra ARM chips and all that kind of stuff. We are not using those in our hosting cluster because those end up getting used for testing rather than for our hosting. One of the reasons that we use the EPYC 7001 series is just because it was very inexpensive and there are some great deals, and I had kind of proven to myself that those would actually work well. And so that's something that we end up using a lot. And if you think about the AMD EPYC 7001 series processors that we're still using to host even to this day, those are kind of older chips. I mean, they were really made in 2017 and they kind of became more mainstream, or I guess you can maybe get systems for more kind of late Q3, Q4. And so that is something that, those systems are basically at this point 3 years old. And so doing a 1-year reserved upfront pricing really kind of doesn't make sense, I guess. So what you can do is you can actually get a 3-year reserve term with some upfront pricing. And so let's kind of go look at that model. So with that one, over 3 years, we're spending, I think, a little over $39,000 in terms of our upfront costs. And we actually get our monthly cost down to under $2,000 a month, of course, assuming that we don't grow our bandwidth needs at all. Now, a lot of people are going to look at something that's a $30,000 to $40,000 server. And if you're a Dell, HP, or Lenovo customer, a lot of you will look at that and say like, oh, well, that's just kind of like maybe one server or something like that. Like, that's not too bad at all. But the way that we do our hosting is that we don't necessarily go for the big service contracts, because what we've proven is that our stuff is actually really reliable. And so we spend a lot less per server than, $30,000 to $40,000, of course. All right, so now that we have the AWS side, let's take a look at what we're going to do on the STH hosting side. And one of the big changes that we're going to do is that I have some hardware changes that I want to make in 2021. The first thing I want to do is I want to upgrade some of our database nodes into use Intel Optane DCPMMs. We still have some that are running on Optane SSDs. And frankly, the DCPMMs are just way faster. One of the issues that we actually have is just the fact that I got a pretty good deal on the 512 gig DIMMs, which are absolutely perfect capacity wise. But the issue is that they don't run on the R series processors because you end up with too much RAM for 1 terabyte processor. So we have to go find some M and L SKUs to be able to even run these large Optane DIMMs. Luckily, those early Cascade Lake M&L chips are actually coming secondhand for pretty reasonable prices now. And so we're going to get some of those and put those in so that way we can run our databases on Optane DIMMs rather than running them on Optane SSDs. So that's kind of the first change. The second thing that we're going to do, now Milan is absolutely awesome. When you guys get to see the performance of it, you will know it is phenomenal. But on the Roam side, actually for what we're using for, especially on just web hosting, Roam actually works really well. And so we will upgrade some of our Epic nodes to Roam and probably some of our older Xeon nodes to Roam as well. We're not necessarily going to buy the most expensive ones because we just tend to need a couple SSDs plus a lot of memory, and that is our basic configuration. I think I also mentioned this earlier, but we are testing the Ampere Ultra. We have the dual 80-core system, so a 160-core ARM-based brand new server. Those realistically, I think we're going to end up getting those in the market more like maybe Q1 or so next year. And we're going to look at maybe putting one of those in at this point. Not 100% sure if I want to go do that or if I want to just keep everything x86, because there are some operational benefits, especially in a small situation like what we have for that. But it might be something I do just to go support the ARM ecosystem. I still haven't made that decision yet. So as a result, we're going to increase our budget to $10,000 for hosting hardware this year. So although we're going to increase our hardware budget to $10,000 this year, you have to also just kind of keep in mind the fact that we didn't really spend our budget in 2018 and we came nowhere close in 19 and 20. And so 2021, we are going to spend some money. We may go a little bit over if I really find a need to, but at the end of the day, we still have been under budget if you kind of look at this on a multi-year journey. On our monthly budgeting costs, what we're going to do is we're going to move from about that $895 level up to a $1,000 a month level. And the reason we're going to budget that is just frankly, we have inflation. Also, just kind of assuming that we're going to spend a little bit more in terms of remote hands, especially if we have other people install some of these upgrades or install nodes. What that means is that our budget, hopefully in 2021, is going to be about $22,000 for hosting. And of that, we're going to have about $1,833-ish per month in terms of our hosting costs. And that's about the same as we would have spent with the Amazon EC2 3-year partial upfront reserved instances in terms of a monthly recurring cost, except that we have our kind of capital outlay along with the recurring costs all in that number instead of having another $39,000 just kind of thrown in. So anyway, when we take a look at those 3 different views and we say, okay, well, how do we turn out? I think we actually turn out way better again in terms of if we do our colocation versus if we did Amazon Web Services. And if you look at the estimates, we're actually even ahead of what we thought we were going to be last time we did this exercise in 2018. Frankly, we could run the site absolutely no problem on the same hardware that we have, but I do like to upgrade things hopefully before they fail, because it's always a little bit easier if we upgrade nodes before they fail rather than after they fail, because it just is nicer. So guys, I hope you enjoyed this. Now, there's certainly a whole lot going into this. I mean, this has been a massive journey since we got our first quarter rack or 10U of cabinet space in Las Vegas in 2013. Hopefully you're going to see a picture of that if we can add that with editing. Now, what's not reflected in this discussion is the fact that, frankly, I know a lot more about colocation than I did in 2013. Now, I did a lot of research in 2013, but I was basically a complete moron on how to do things. There is a lot of that know-how and just making sure that we are scoping things correctly, budgeting correctly, and all that we didn't necessarily have in 2013. All of those lessons learned make it a lot easier to go make this decision than it was in 2013 when it was coming down to spreadsheets and really just the very small budget that we had. Now, hey, if you want to hear some of the stories that we had, good and bad, about colocation, happy to share those. And if you want to see those, just drop a comment and let me know. Now, one thing I don't want to do is give people the idea that AWS is like the completely wrong solution, it's a complete ripoff or whatever that is. We're talking about a very specific application, which is this kind of web hosting. We have a very specific use case where, let's face it, server hardware, just not that many people go look at that compared to looking at new phones or celebrity images or whatever the heck it is, right? We just don't have the same level of scale, or we don't necessarily have the same peaks and valleys that other sites do. Now, AWS is absolutely the correct option for a lot of different applications. Just for us, the fact that we can chase falling bandwidth prices and, the fact that hardware and memory prices go down and new technologies in terms of, like Optane and stuff like that are available, just means that we can do things a lot more cost effectively by doing colocation. And frankly, the fact that, well, I'm not a total moron when it comes to servers helps a lot because I can tell exactly, number one, what we should go use, what the right buying cycles are and all that kind of stuff that a lot of people just don't have the knowledge to be able to navigate. AWS takes away the need for all that knowledge and necessarily some of that research that people that don't have that kind of background would need to know. So there are some costs that we're not even including in here, and those are important as well. But hey, while this may not be a perfect analysis, it just is generally kind of how we look at things. And you may look at things completely differently. But if you did like this video, why don't you click subscribe, turn on those notifications so you can see whenever we come out with new content. Again, if you did want to hear about some of those kind of tips and trips, be sure to leave that in the description. And as always, thanks for watching and have an awesome day.